It was a quiet afternoon in the bustling city. The sun cast a warm, golden hue through the window, illuminating Jack's desk, which was neatly arranged with papers, a well-worn notebook, and a map of the world. Jack, the young detective, sat back in his chair, deep in thought. He had been working on a few cases, but his mind wandered. The world outside seemed peaceful, but Jack knew better than to trust appearances. The world was always a bit more complicated than it seemed. Suddenly, the phone rang, breaking the calm. Jack's sharp mind instantly shifted into gear. He grabbed the receiver with quick precision, his voice steady as he answered. "Detective Jack speaking." The voice on the other end sounded urgent, almost frantic. "Detective Jack, we have a serious problem. A top diplomat from a major country has gone missing." Jack straightened in his chair, his attention fully captured. He had worked on many complex cases before, but this was something different. "A diplomat missing?" Jack repeated, already feeling the weight of the situation. "Which country, Sampson?" "Ambassador Thomas Greenwood from the United States. He's been involved in an important international summit. His disappearance, it could cause a serious international crisis if we don't act quickly." Jack felt a rush of adrenaline. A missing diplomat at such a crucial time could destabilize entire regions, even countries. The stakes couldn't be higher. "I'll be there right away," Jack said, his voice firm. Within minutes, Jack had gathered his essential tools, a magnifying glass, his notebook, and the well-worn map of international relations he'd been studying for years. It wasn't just any map. It was a map filled with notes and connections, the result of countless hours of research. Jack understood the delicate balance of power between nations, and he knew that every twist and turn in a situation like this mattered. As he drove toward the summit's location, Jack couldn't help but reflect on the broader implications of the case. He'd read Henry Kissinger's World Order in his younger years, and it had opened his eyes to the complexity of global diplomacy. Kissinger spoke of the balance of power among nations, the intricate web of alliances and rivalries that kept the peace, or disrupted it. One missing diplomat could unravel years of careful negotiations. The summit where Ambassador Greenwood had disappeared was supposed to be a place of cooperation, where countries met to discuss pressing global issues. But now it was a place of confusion and fear. What if someone had taken the diplomat to manipulate the negotiations? What if someone was trying to shift the balance of global power? Jack's thoughts raced as he considered the possibilities. When Jack arrived at the venue, he was greeted by a flurry of activity. The usually organized summit had descended into chaos. Security guards moved hastily, and diplomats whispered anxiously among themselves. It was clear that no one knew what to do next. Jack wasted no time. He was led to the last known location of Ambassador Greenwood, a conference room filled with high-ranking officials from multiple countries. The room was still and eerily quiet. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture. On the table lay a few documents, some of them marked with the insignia of the international summit, others with the names of the world's leading powers. Jack skimmed through the papers quickly, but none of them offered any clear answers. The ambassador had been in the middle of high-stakes talks, and now he was gone. Jack paced around the room, piecing together the scene in his mind. Who stood to gain from Greenwood's disappearance? Was it a political maneuver, or something more sinister? There had to be a reason behind it. But what was it? And more importantly, who could have orchestrated such an act? As he examined the documents on the table, one particular note caught his eye. It was a rough sketch of an alliance map, showing the countries involved in the summit and their positions on various global issues. The lines between allies and adversaries were clearly drawn, but there was one area that seemed off. Jack wasn't sure yet how it fit, but something about it didn't feel right. A missing diplomat in the middle of a tense summit wasn't just a mystery. It was a high-stakes puzzle, and Jack knew that each clue could have far-reaching consequences. As he left the room and headed back to his car, Jack's mind worked through the details. He wasn't just looking for a missing person. He was looking for answers to a much bigger question. Who was trying to disrupt the balance of power, and why? Jack arrived at the summit's venue, a grand and imposing building at the heart of the city. Security was tighter than usual, with guards stationed at every corner, checking IDs and scanning guests as they entered. Despite the heightened security, a sense of chaos seemed to hang in the air. Jack was ushered into the building and led through the vast hallways by a member of the summit's security team. The team member, a man with a stern face and clipped voice, escorted Jack to the large conference room where Ambassador Thomas Greenwood had been last seen. As they walked down the hallway, Jack couldn't help but notice the tension in the air, the nervous glances exchanged between diplomats, the quiet whispers of worried staff members. It was as if the very foundation of the summit had been shaken. They reached the conference hall, which had once been filled with the world's most influential leaders. Now, it was eerily empty, save for a few scattered papers on the polished wooden floor. The sunlight from the grand windows cast long shadows across the room, adding to the somber mood. Jack stood in the middle of the room, his eyes scanning the surroundings. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just about a missing person. This was about something far more complex. This wasn't a typical kidnapping. The stakes were much higher, and the implications stretched far beyond the borders of this room. Who would want to harm such a respected diplomat? Jack wondered aloud, more to himself than anyone else. The security officer, standing a few feet away, shifted uncomfortably, but didn't answer. Jack's mind was already racing through the possibilities. A man like Ambassador Greenwood was not just a diplomat. He was a symbol of the fragile peace between rival nations, a key figure in a web of negotiations that spanned the globe. Removing him from the equation was no small matter. It could throw the entire world into turmoil. Jack glanced at the table where the ambassador had last sat. A few papers remained scattered across the surface, some marked with the official seals of various countries. Jack carefully picked up a piece of paper, studying it for a moment. It was a detailed meeting schedule, listing the diplomats and world leaders that Greenwood was scheduled to meet during the summit. The list was extensive, filled with high-profile names from both rival and allied countries. There was one meeting in particular that stood out to Jack, a meeting between Greenwood and representatives from two nations with long-standing tensions. Their relationship had always been volatile, but if Greenwood could broker a peace deal between them, it would have been a monumental achievement. Jack's eyes narrowed as he considered the implications. Why had Greenwood been meeting with these countries? Was he working to bring them together, or had something darker been at play? Could someone have used the ambassador's position to manipulate the summit for their own gain? The balance of power between these nations was delicate, and any disruption could cause a chain reaction of events that would ripple out across the globe. Jack thought back to Henry Kissinger's words in World Order, where he had spoken of the fragile balance of global power. One misstep, one wrong decision, could upset the entire system. The world's leaders understood this, and they guarded their positions carefully. The ambassador's disappearance couldn't have been random. It had to be part of a much larger political maneuver. But who stood to gain from such a move? As Jack walked around the room, his eyes settled on a large map pinned to the wall. It was a map of the world's alliances, a visual representation of the complex network of relations between nations. Some lines were bold and clear, signifying strong alliances, while others were thin and delicate, representing fragile truces between former enemies. Jack studied the map intently, his mind working through the puzzle in front of him. "This isn't just a kidnapping," he muttered under his breath. "This is something far more dangerous." He could feel it, the subtle but powerful forces at play, each move strategically designed to tip the balance of power. Who could be behind this, and what did they want? Jack knew that finding the answers would require digging deeper into the global web of intrigue that was spun across the summit. Every piece of the puzzle was connected, and if he was going to solve this case, he needed to understand the bigger picture. For now, Jack had to follow the threads that tied the diplomat's disappearance to the delicate negotiations happening behind closed doors. One false move, and the world could be thrown into chaos. The game was far from over. It had only just begun. As Jack continued to investigate the disappearance of Ambassador Thomas Greenwood, he found himself drawn deeper into a world where diplomacy and history intertwined. Each piece of evidence led him to an unsettling realization. This case was not just about the missing diplomat. It was rooted in the past, in the complex history of international relations and decades of tension between rival nations. The ambassador had been deeply involved in delicate peace talks between two countries with a long history of conflict. Countries that, for years, had been teetering on the edge of war, relying on negotiations to maintain a fragile peace. Jack's mind raced. The disappearance could be the result of some covert political maneuver, a ploy to destabilize not just the peace process, but the entire global order. He thought back to Henry Kissinger's words in World Order, where he had described the key role of diplomacy and compromise behind the scenes. Kissinger had been a master of negotiation, a man who had helped shape the world's power dynamics through careful talks and strategic alliances. For years, Jack had admired how Kissinger had maintained peace through diplomacy, often in quiet, closed-door meetings, working to ensure that no one move would set off a global catastrophe. The more Jack thought about it, the clearer it became. The disappearance of Ambassador Greenwood was tied to something far deeper, something that had been brewing for decades. This wasn't just a political kidnapping. It was part of a larger game, a power struggle that had been silently simmering behind the scenes for years. Jack knew that to solve this case, he needed to understand the history of these nations, the delicate alliances, and the players involved. That's when he reached out to Professor Green, an old historian who specialized in international relations. Professor Green was an expert on global diplomacy and the fragile alliances that had shaped the world order over the years. Jack had worked with him on a few other cases in the past, and he knew that if anyone could shed light on the deeper history behind this case, it was the professor. Jack found Professor Green in his office, surrounded by stacks of books and piles of ancient maps. The professor was hunched over his desk, scribbling notes as he meticulously reviewed old records. He looked up as Jack entered the room, a gleam of recognition in his eyes. "Detective Jack," the professor said warmly, gesturing for him to sit. "What brings you here today?" Jack didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "I need your help, Professor. I'm investigating the disappearance of Ambassador Thomas Greenwood. He was involved in peace talks between two nations with a long history of conflict. I believe this goes back decades, into the heart of global diplomacy." Professor Green paused, his expression turning serious. "Ah, yes," he said thoughtfully. "I've heard of Greenwood. He was a key player in the peace process between those two countries. A delicate balance of power, carefully managed for years." Jack nodded. "That's exactly it. It's not just about one man disappearing. It's about the power struggle that could be unfolding behind the scenes. If someone's trying to disrupt these peace talks, it could unravel the entire global system." The professor leaned back in his chair, stroking his chin. "You're right to think that way, Jack. This is more than just a case of one missing diplomat. The balance of power between these nations is precarious at best. There are forces at play that have been in motion for decades. The diplomat knew too much. He knew the intricacies of the alliances and rivalries that held these countries together. And if someone wanted to upset that balance, well, he would have been a target." Professor Green stood up and walked over to a large map pinned to the wall. It was an old, faded map of international alliances, a visual representation of the shifting allegiances between countries over the years. He pulled it down from the wall and handed it to Jack. "Take a look at this," the professor said. "This map tells the story of every major shift in global power. These lines represent the fragile alliances, the treaties, the negotiations that have kept the peace, or nearly failed to. If someone were to disrupt these alliances, it would be catastrophic." Jack studied the map, his fingers tracing the intricate lines connecting countries across continents. He began to see the bigger picture, the delicate web of international relations, each country tied to the others by both mutual interests and long-standing rivalries. "This diplomat," Jack said slowly, "he was more than just a negotiator. He was the one holding the threads of peace together." The professor nodded gravely. "Exactly. And now that he's gone, someone is trying to pull those threads apart. It's a game changer, Jack. You need to understand this. This isn't just about one man's disappearance. It's about the entire global order." Jack's mind was racing. He now saw the scale of the stakes. This was no longer just a missing person case. It was a battle for control of the global power structure, a struggle that could reshape the world as they knew it. And Jack was at the center of it all. With a list of suspects in hand, Jack set out on the next phase of his investigation. He needed to speak with the leaders and representatives of the nations involved in the summit. He started with the diplomats, the movers and shakers who had a stake in the negotiations and the peace talks that had been at the heart of Ambassador Greenwood's work. As he visited each country's representatives, Jack noticed something unsettling. Some were nervous, their voices shaky and their eyes darting around as if they feared someone might be listening. Others seemed unaffected, almost too calm, as if they didn't believe the situation was as serious as it seemed. Jack's instincts told him that something was off. This wasn't just about one diplomat vanishing. It was tied to something far larger, a complex web of international interests that stretched beyond the summit's walls. Jack couldn't help but feel that one of these leaders was hiding something, and the missing diplomat was simply a pawn in a much bigger game. Could it be a rival nation, hoping to tip the balance of power in their favor? Or was it someone inside the summit itself, perhaps a mole or an insider, trying to manipulate the situation for their own gain? The possibilities were endless, but Jack was determined to find out who was behind it all. His next stop was the embassy where Ambassador Greenwood had worked before taking up his position at the summit. Jack knew that diplomats often had deep ties to their home country's intelligence services, and that the embassy might hold important clues about the forces at play. As he arrived, he noticed something immediately. The security was unusually tight. Guards were stationed at every entrance, and the usual hustle and bustle of embassy staff was replaced with an air of quiet tension. Jack was escorted into a sleek, modern meeting room where a foreign minister waited. The minister, a tall, imposing man with a sharp gaze, stood to greet him. "Detective Jack," he said in a smooth, controlled voice. "We've been expecting you. Please have a seat. We know the importance of this situation, but you must understand. Things are changing. The world is at a tipping point. There are forces working behind the scenes that seek to disrupt the order." Jack took a seat, his mind racing. The minister's words were cryptic, but Jack sensed the weight of them. He had heard similar sentiments from other diplomats, hints of unease, of something lurking just below the surface. The balance of power was shifting, and Jack could feel it. But what did the minister mean by forces behind the scenes? The foreign minister continued, his voice steady but edged with urgency. Ambassador Greenwood was more than just a diplomat. He was a key player in the negotiations between two rival nations, nations that have been locked in a delicate dance of power for years. His work was important, not just for us, but for the world. And now that he's gone, there are those who will stop at nothing to ensure that the peace process falls apart. Jack leaned forward, absorbing every word. "So you believe someone's trying to sabotage the negotiations?" he asked. The minister nodded. "It's more than sabotage, detective. It's an attempt to disrupt the entire order. There are global players involved, rival powers, each one seeking to shift the balance in their favor. Some would prefer chaos, some seek to weaken the power of others. But there are also those who want peace. Those who understand that if we don't maintain this fragile order, we risk plunging the world into instability." Ambassador Greenwood knew too much about the delicate alliances that held everything together. He was a target for anyone seeking to tip the scales. Jack sat back, piecing together the information. This wasn't just about one man. It was about the entire global system. The diplomat had been at the center of a struggle for control, and now his disappearance threatened to unravel everything. Jack could almost see the web of global interests stretching before him. The rival powers, the shifting alliances, the desperate measures some might take to preserve or gain control. "Are you telling me that someone within the summit is responsible?" Jack asked, his voice low. The minister hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the door as if to ensure no one was listening. "I don't know, but I suspect there's more to this than a simple disappearance. There are players in this game who are hidden in the shadows, working in ways we can't even comprehend. But the truth is, detective, the world is changing, and Greenwood was caught in the middle of it. He may have been trying to hold it all together, but now, everything is at risk." Jack absorbed the weight of the minister's words. This case had grown beyond his original understanding. It wasn't just about a missing person. It was about the global order itself, and the forces that sought to control it. The diplomat's disappearance was merely the beginning of something much larger. Jack could feel the pressure mounting. Time was running out, and he was getting closer to uncovering the forces that were pulling the strings behind the scenes. He left the embassy with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. Whoever was behind this disappearance was playing a dangerous game, and the consequences of their actions could be catastrophic. Jack now had to find the pieces that would reveal the true mastermind behind the plot. Weeks of investigation had led Jack to a final, breathtaking revelation. He had followed the threads of international intrigue, navigated through layers of deception, and pieced together the smallest of clues until the puzzle was nearly complete. The diplomat, Ambassador Thomas Greenwood, had been missing for far longer than anyone had suspected. The deeper Jack dug, the more it became apparent that this wasn't just a political disappearance. It was part of a grand scheme to prevent a shift in global power. After hours of poring over the diplomat's schedule, correspondence, and hidden messages, Jack made an astonishing discovery. The ambassador had been in possession of a secret document, one that could change the course of international diplomacy. It contained critical information about a peace deal between two countries on the brink of war. The document had the potential to alter alliances and bring about a lasting peace, a monumental achievement in the world of global relations. But Jack soon realized that there were forces working tirelessly to ensure that this deal would never come to fruition. The diplomat's disappearance wasn't a random act. It was a calculated move to keep the world from changing. Someone with immense power, someone desperate to maintain the status quo, had orchestrated the whole thing. Jack's hunch had been correct all along. The diplomat had been taken not just to silence him, but to stop the deal he was working so tirelessly to broker. The balance of global power couldn't afford to shift. Jack's heart raced as the pieces fell into place. The forces behind this were far-reaching, but now, he could see the path forward. The diplomat was alive. Somewhere. Hidden. Out of sight. Waiting to be found. Jack's instincts had led him to a location on the outskirts of the city, an abandoned building long forgotten by most. He had no time to waste. The clock was ticking, and the fate of the peace talks hung in the balance. Jack arrived at the location, his mind sharp and focused. He had been here before in his thoughts, but now he was stepping into the heart of the mystery. The building was a shell of its former self, with crumbling walls and darkened windows. But within its decaying structure, Jack found what he was looking for. The diplomat. Bruised but very much alive, locked away in a small room. The moment they locked eyes, Jack could see the relief in the ambassador's gaze. He had been caught in a dangerous web, but now he was free. As Jack helped him out of the building, the diplomat shared his story. A tale of being betrayed, of narrowly escaping a plot that would have framed him for espionage, and of the shadowy figures who had hoped to use him as a pawn in their larger scheme. The plot had been diabolical, designed to ruin the diplomat's reputation and prevent the peace talks from continuing. Jack listened intently, piecing together the final fragments of the conspiracy. He knew now that the entire international order had been under threat. The forces who had orchestrated the diplomat's disappearance weren't just trying to stop a peace deal. They were trying to hold on to the fragile balance of power that had existed for decades. A balance that, if disrupted, could change the entire landscape of global politics. But with Jack's quick thinking, and his deep understanding of the delicate nature of international relations, honed through his study of world order, he had saved the day. He had uncovered the conspiracy, thwarted those who wished to upset the global order, and ensured that the diplomat would return safely to the summit. The peace talks resumed, and the world was once again on the path to stability. Nations who had been on the verge of war were now willing to sit down and negotiate once more. Jack had done what no one else could. He had prevented a catastrophe, protecting the delicate balance that held the world together. As Jack stood on the steps of the embassy, watching the diplomat return to the summit, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The world had been saved, but the danger had not passed. The balance of power was always fragile, and it would continue to be tested. Jack knew that his work was never truly finished. There would always be new challenges, new conspiracies to uncover, new threats to peace that needed his attention. He looked out over the city. a sense of quiet determination settling over him. The world was at peace. For now. But Jack knew that in the shadows, the game of international politics was always being played, and new cases were waiting for him on the horizon. With every twist and turn, Jack's journey as a detective would continue, ready to face whatever came next. The world might have been saved, but for Jack, the fight for peace was a never-ending one. And as long as there were mysteries to solve, Jack the detective would be there, watching, waiting, ready to protect the fragile order that kept the world from falling into chaos.